Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities, and I am delighted to see the turnout today in this grisly kind of not so sunny day. And so it says a lot about the nature of the topic we are presenting on tonight and the speaker who honored us with his presence. And my name is Anouar Majid. I'm the director of the Center for Global Humanities, and I've always been assisted by by excellent colleagues all over the place here in this room. Some in the back, they're filming us, and an old-time friend and an ally, and who has been instrumental in helping me set up the center. He's with us tonight too, Neil Gendreau. Some of you may remember who he is. He sits there. And so without much ado, I'd like to present Tom Fisher, or Thomas Fisher. He's a professor in the School of Architecture, the Dayton Hudson Chair in Urban Design at the University of Minnesota, and the director of the Minnesota Design Center at the College of Design. He was recognized in 2005 as the 5th most published writer about architecture in the United States. He has written 9 books, more than 50 book chapters or introductions, and more than 400 articles in professional journals and major publications. Named a top 25 design educator 4 times by Design Intelligence, he has lectured at 36 universities and more than 150 professional and public meetings. So please help me welcome Tom Fisher to the podium.
Thank you. Good to be here. Although my discipline is architecture, I'm actually not going to show buildings or talk about architecture tonight. I'm going to talk about my newest book, which really came out of years of writing for the Huffington Post about basically design thinking and its applications to a lot of the dysfunctional systems that we all suffer from in the world today. You know, I'm really pleased to be here as well as part of a Global Humanities program. Even though I have an architecture degree, I also have a degree in intellectual history. And so I've always been a strong believer that the humanities have a lot to contribute to the way in which we design the world that we are in. The argument in this book is that we tend to think that our economic system, our political system, our educational system, that these are somehow givens, that somehow they're bigger than what any of us can control or change. And the argument is that these are all designed systems like everything else, like this room has been designed. These systems have been designed. When they're not working well, they really need to be redesigned. And so the argument in the book is basically that. But what I'd like to do is then tonight is to take you through a larger argument that is sort of underlying a lot of it, which is something that I learned a lot as an architect, which is that there are no universal solutions to anything. We learned in architecture back in the 20th century when we tried to build glass skyscrapers in every city around the world that, in fact, that doesn't work, that climates are different, cultures are different. And so we learned the hard way that universal solutions to problems are usually highly flawed. The idea as well from that is that you have to respond to context and culture, and that not only is there no universal solution, but actually it's better if we develop systems that are much more adaptive to differences and diversity. And so what I'd like to do is to go through a number of the systems that we all suffer with and talk about how that thinking really applies. I'm working on an article right now with a colleague around what do we do in the wake of the failed healthcare bill that just did not pass Congress. To me, it was a classic example of design failure. Designed by a few politicians in back rooms, never engaging the people most affected by it, and then trying to get this thing passed to become the law of the land, as if there was a single healthcare law that could then apply to everybody. Well, they discovered that, in fact, the very assumption that there could be this single solution that a few people cooked up that could apply to everybody was itself bad design. And so the article is really making an argument of, so what would the design community do in the wake of this failure? Well, what we would do is we would get as many different experiments going as possible. One of the advantages we have in the United States is we have 50 states. We should have at least 50 experiments going on right now. We should encourage every state to try something, and let's see what works. And the things that in fact work really well, then we talk about scaling them up. And so instead of it being about some people in Washington thinking they can figure all this out, is in fact engage people bottom up, involve everybody with a stake in this issue, and to try as many different things as possible. And so that gives you a sense of the way I think and the way I view design thinking as having a role to play in some of the critical issues that we are now facing in the world. So just a little bit about design thinking. You know, in some ways this has become a new pop term. Business schools all are teaching it these days, and other professional programs. And of course, I come from a college of design, so all of the design disciplines, of course, teach this. But in a way, this is a very old idea. I mean, humans have been designing things for ourselves since we began as a species 200,000 years ago. I mean, we are a relatively weak species. We're not as fast or as strong as other species. We don't carry our housing with us in terms of fur and what have you. And so we have always had to design environments for ourselves in order to survive. And so we are actually very good at this. Another bit of the work that I do, I gave a talk about design thinking at a neuroscience conference, because another part of this is, while there are people such as myself and maybe some of you in the room who have a design background and went to college to study it, I make the argument that there's something inherent in the way the brain is organized that makes all of us really good at this. We now know that when you hold up something, that we put the language in one part of our brain and the function of something in another part of our brain, and form and color in yet other parts. And so you hold up a watch, we know what it is, what it does. Our brain is one of the most powerful recombinant organs in the universe. We immediately know what this is, but we know that the brain's efficiency comes from sorting it into different parts of the brain. So what we do as creative people, what design does, is that we intentionally miscombine things. We know that this is a watch, but we're going to call it something else. We're going to imagine it having a different function. We're going to imagine it at a different scale. In other words, creativity is a teachable process. It's a rigorous process, and it is inherent in every human being. We all have the ability to be creative. What happens is we now have an educational system, and I'll talk a bit more about this a bit later, that drums us out of it, makes us feel embarrassed about being creative. Around second grade, we start getting graded for being correct rather than being creative. And that is one of the worst things we do to kids. And so there's no, it's sort of no mystery that around second, third grades, kids start hating school. Because the very thing that the human brain is good at doing is the very thing that we are sort of punished for doing. And so part of this relearning how creativity happens, this design process, is part of rediscovering ourselves, getting to know ourselves again, and exploring the real capacity in everyone's brain to do this. As one way to describe this comes from a firm called IDEO out in California, who have done a lot of work in this area. It's, they sort of talk about it having 5 steps, this kind of empathetic understanding of people. And again, this is where I would argue that the current healthcare bill that failed really failed hugely, which was an unempathetic way of understanding how this was actually going to affect real people. As I gave a talk on my book to a public policy forum, and I said that ideology kills innovation. Of course, they didn't want to hear that, and mainly the whole Q&A was arguing that, because I said our politics has become so ideological that they already know the answer even before you've asked the question. Right? Creativity does not work that way. Creativity opens itself up. The whole role of creativity is to not know the answer and to discover new questions that nobody's asked before. So as our politics have become incredibly ideological, it has absolutely killed innovation. It has made this process impossible. And so you empathize, you understand the people who are most affected by a decision, and you engage them, you involve them in it, in the same way that an architect involves the clients. If you're designing somebody's house, you involve the homeowners. Well, what do you want? You don't design the house because you have some idea of what a house should be, you involve them. And you define the problem, you develop ideas, and this is where that sort of lateral thinking that's built into our brains is so good at, where you start to imagine maybe things you've already seen and applied in new ways. Then you prototype. Another thing about this gets to this innovation that I'm arguing in this paper we should be doing in the healthcare system. You get as many prototypes, as many models, as many options as possible, and you see which work. And then you test them. And then sometimes it doesn't work the first time, and you iterate. You go back and you start the process again. And so this is really how innovation happens. This is how it happens in every field. This is everything that is designed goes through this process. And part of the argument in the book is that we're not doing this in a lot of the systems. In other words, we are very used to thinking about design of objects. The chairs you're sitting in, the clothing we're wearing, all have been designed. This room has been designed. Your cars, everything, just about everything we encounter in life has been designed. But I argue in the book that just as in the universe, we now know that but only about 5% of the universe is visible to us. That we know that there is dark energy and dark matter out there, because if there wasn't, the universe wouldn't hold together. And in the book, I make the same argument about design. We have largely focused design on physical design, on the stuff that we use every day, but that there is a much larger area of work in terms of systems that have physical effects and systems that are not physical. The healthcare system, the political system, the economic system. These are huge designed systems that affect us every day, and we don't think of them as being designed, and so we don't think that we can redesign them. And my argument is we absolutely can, and we absolutely have to, because we can't continue to have the kind of dysfunctional politics that we have, or we can't continue to have an economy that leaves so many people behind. I mean, it's simply dysfunctional. So, so let me get into parts of the book. So in the book, I also make the argument that scale matters. Now, again, for a designer, this is a kind of obvious thing. We know that the chairs that you're sitting on, they can't be twice the size they are. They wouldn't function as a chair, right? They couldn't be half the size they are. You couldn't sit in them. In other words, in design, scale matters. The desks you're sitting at have to be at a certain height to be comfortable, right? We don't understand, though, that scale applies to all design systems, not just cars and chairs and rooms, but in economies, for example. So I've long been influenced by Adam Smith, and in large part because I think he's completely misunderstood by the advocates of capitalism. And this, of course, we're aware of his Wealth of Nations, but Adam Smith said you can't understand the Wealth of Nations without reading my other book, a book that almost nobody ever reads, maybe because it has a really dull title called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. But what he argues in there is essentially that capitalism is scale sensitive, that capitalism is a system that has to be held at bay by moral sentiment. He argued that you don't pollute the water that you also have to drink from. You don't pollute the air that you also have to breathe. You don't exploit the person who's working in your factory who also is your neighbor, right? In other words, moral sentiment keeps capitalism from being extreme or excessive. The problem is we now have global capitalism. We now can pollute air and water halfway around the world. We can exploit people around the world and never meet them. We have basically disconnected capitalism from moral sentiment. He would argue that is not capitalism. We do not have capitalism in this country. We have some perverse notion of what he meant. The other thing about the Wealth of Nations, which I think is significant, is right at the very beginning, he starts with this idea called the paradox of value. And in it, well, I'll get to that soon. Let me finish this thought. So in it, he says, why do we value diamonds that we don't need, and we don't value water without which we can live, right? And there's a very common, well-known economics explanation for that, which is that, well, obviously diamonds are scarce, and so they're high-priced, and so we value them because they're rare. Water seems to be plentiful, so we don't value it, right? But I think Smith was getting at another point, which I think is also misunderstood in the economics community. He was basically arguing this idea between, as Marx said, between exchange value and use value. And in a community, if you were really given, let's say the world was everybody, that we in this room were the world, right? And we were given the choice, would you rather have diamonds or water? What would we decide, right? We would all take the water, thank you very much, because diamonds really don't mean anything to anybody. And so he was making the argument, how can you develop an economic system where you can do well and do good at the same time, where you could value water, that recognizing, Smith was a Stoic. He was actually a professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow, and he argued that the accumulation of wealth is a stupid thing to do. That you basically, those who value diamonds don't know value. They don't understand value. And so the part of the argument I make in the book is that we've misunderstood what capitalism is about. We've misunderstood that it is scale sensitive. And so a lot of my arguments are about rescaling the world. Because when we do design, we recognize that you don't design a whole city, you design it in a way at a scale that people can have involvement in it. You do it sort of one building at a time, one piece at a time. And what we have tended to do with these systems is we design these very large systems that affect everybody in kind of dramatic ways, and essentially have been making the human population a bunch of guinea pigs. That we launch a law that has not been vetted, has not gone through a design process. We foist this onto the public. Then we discover how it doesn't work very well, so we write another law to deal with all of the unintended consequences of the first law because it was never designed well to begin with. And we develop essentially a Rube Goldberg kind of notion of what public policy and what our economy and our politics look like. So part of the argument is we have to stop doing that. So part of this is rescaling the economy, and I'd like to make an argument here that we are also at a moment in time when capitalism itself is evolving away from the nation state to, as writers such as this have argued, and Jane Jacobs, who is well known in my field for a book that she wrote on the death and life of great American cities, which really ended urban renewal in this country. But she also wrote a series of books on economics, which have been very influential to me. She basically argues that in the 21st century, we are moving away from the nation state as the unit, and in part she argues because it's too big. Nations, at least the United States, is too large an economic unit. We're moving toward city-based regional economies, where the Boston region is in competition with the Atlanta region or with the London or Manchester region. In other words, that the way in which we are now beginning to organize ourselves in the world is around regional economies, a rescaling of the economy. And to me, the importance of that is you begin to put back moral sentiment into the economy. That if you are tending to your region, you, for example, pay attention to what's happening in rural areas. I think one of the worst things that has happened as part of our politics is that somehow there's this divide between blue America and red America, between cities and rural areas. And the problem with that is that that's not how regional economies thrive. If your region is not paying attention to the rural areas in your region will not do well. You know, Boston will not do well if it doesn't pay attention to what's happening in rural New Hampshire and rural Maine and what have you, in rural Massachusetts. And so, you know, part of this, the argument in the book is that we have to understand what is the competitive strategy going forward. It's not about polarizing cities and country. It's about understanding what is our region and what value do we bring. There have been some interesting maps. This was a recent one that came out from the Atlantic published it, which looked at basically commuting sheds, which I think is significant because essentially this is a kind of a bottom-up, ground-up a map of the economic regions in this country. These are the places that people associate with. Now, of course, there's large parts of the country that aren't part of any region, and that may be true. And yet I think it's also interesting to understand and value the regions that we have and to find ways in which everybody in a region is a participant in thinking about the future of that region, that it's not simply something that happens only in the city or only in state legislatures or city halls, but that in fact there are ways in which we develop regional mechanisms. One of the things I spent a big part of my career here in New England. I lived in New Haven, Connecticut, and moving to Minnesota 20 years ago was really quite a surprise to me because they have incredibly strong regional government. And what they essentially do is that they tax the wealthy suburbs to support the cities. And a lot of, while there's some controversies about that power of regional government I've seen is really how you can have a region that can thrive in this global economy. And so, part of this is also looking at this rural urban interdependence. This is a project that was recently just built in downtown Minneapolis, and it's the largest, tallest solid timber building ever built. And what's significant about it is that there's this new technology and architecture called cross-laminated timber, which allows us to basically build high buildings out of wood rather than concrete or steel. But to me, what's significant about it is that it was an effort to revitalize a wood products industry that was dying in northern Minnesota. In other words, innovation, which often happens in cities, related to research universities, are the ways in which we can help imagine new futures for rural America. And so instead of leaving rural America behind, part of our innovation needs to include how do we use that to revive rural economies. I think that I'm working with a group of colleagues. We're imagining, for example, a sharing economy in rural America. What would be an Uber solution to the challenges of farmers? And when we talk to farmers, what we hear from them is that they can't afford this equipment anymore. The equipment is just outrageously expensive for them. And so we're starting to imagine a sharing economy model where there's a kind of an Uber version of farm equipment, where you need a plow, okay, it'll arrive soon, and you pay for access. And so I think that using some of these new ways of thinking about the economy can be also, I think, a strategy for helping communities that think like they don't have much of a future, when in fact it's simply about reimagining themselves, using their own creativity to say, well, what are we good at? Maybe farming isn't necessarily our future, but maybe there's some other way in which we can, in the case of cross-laminated timber, use a resource in a new way. So part of this is this sort of rescaling of production as well. So Jeremy Rifkin, another economist who's been an influence on me, talks a lot about the third industrial revolution. And again, I think that this is significant. In many ways, it brings capitalism for me back to closer to the way in which it was first envisioned. And the argument that Rifkin and others are making is that, we've gone through three different industrial revolutions. The 19th century one that we're all familiar with, which began with the steam engine. The second industrial revolution, which we tend not to think about as much in this way, really begins with the Model T and Henry Ford and the assembly line process and the idea of a 20th century economy which was about mass production. And the argument here is that we are rapidly moving into a third industrial revolution, which is a move from mass production to mass customization. And it is a move away from the idea of large assembly plants making things as commodities to the idea of individuals being empowered to make things themselves. An example of this is, of course, this involves a lot of digitizing and automation. And so there's also a downside to this economy, which is like all the previous industrial revolutions. There are people who are going to be left behind by it, and we need to address that. For example, I do quite a lot of research on the rise of autonomous vehicles and shared autonomous vehicle systems that are starting to emerge. And the challenge is that one of the first adopters of this technology are going to be long-distance trucking, right? So the most common job in America right now is truck driver. just as it used to be in the 19th century farmer until farming became automated. In the 20th century, the most common job was secretary. And we know what happened to secretaries once the computer came into being. And so we are facing a future where probably a few million truck drivers are going to be put out of work. And so how do we help make those transitions? Again, this idea of moral sentiment. How do we simply not view people as somehow an externality that gets ejected from the economy and they're on their own, and in fact help them understand what is their asset, what are their capabilities, how do we leverage their own creativity to imagine a different future for themselves, because these changes will happen. And so to give you an example of this, so the first two industrial revolutions started with a vehicle, the steam engine or the Model T. I argue in the book that this is maybe the signal vehicle for the third industrial revolution, the mass customization economy. This is the world's first 3D printed car. There it is being printed on the left and driven off. And that may seem, you know, a little whiz-bang perhaps, but imagine that. Imagine you're Ford or GM and you have this enormous company to mass produce cars. How can you compete with somebody that can hit the print button, print the car and drive away, right? In other words, this is how revolutions happen. It's not simply that they happen slowly, they upend the previous economy. And part of this is that just as this will have dramatic effects on the auto industry, and this technology is being linked to autonomous vehicle technology, Lyft are quite interested in this. And so we are already recognizing that a huge part of our economy is about to be seriously disrupted, the making of cars and the selling of cars. Ford right now is envisioning a future, and you may have noticed in some of their recent advertising, they don't call themselves a car company anymore, they're a mobility company. And they talk about bike sharing and car sharing and what have you, because they already see the writing on the wall. They envision a future in which they may still make cars, they may in fact 3D print cars, and they will continue to own them, and we will have contracts with them, a mobility contract. We will call up our Ford car to tell us, take me home or take me where I want to go. It will take us to where we want to go, and it will continue on to the next call. It's basically automated taxi services at about 1/4 the price of actually owning and operating a car. And imagine, I'm doing work looking at the impact it's going to have on cities. Imagine all the space we give to storing vehicles, all of the surface parking lots, all of the garages in everybody's house, all of the driveways. I mean, imagine how much of the surface of the planet we now use to store vehicles. This technology, within about a decade, will make the storing of vehicles essentially go away. And so all of a sudden, cities, our own houses, we all just picked up the size of our garage in terms of space. We can just put the rest of our junk in it, right? But not our cars, because we probably won't own cars. Google, in fact, now is a model where they're thinking what Google will do is that the ride in the vehicle will be free, the way Google is free to use, if you're willing to look at the advertising as you do in the back of a New York taxi on your way to wherever you're going. Essentially, they're thinking of the future of free transportation for everybody. And so these are tremendously powerful kinds of changes that are happening. The mass customization about this is once you can 3D print your car, you can also print it any way you want. I mean, you can put your name all over it. You sort of can customize it. So instead of us all driving cars that increasingly all look alike, we're going to start to see vehicles that actually look quite different from each other. And the autonomous technology will also lead us to new kinds of transportation vehicles that we don't even imagine yet, sort of hybrids between cars and buses and what have you. So politics, what about rescaling our politics? This is a map of the sort of voting pattern in the last election. And even though, of course, red is dominant in terms of geography, it's essentially about 50-50 in terms of population. And so what would that, rescaling of our politics look like? And again, I make the argument that we are this kind of hybrid of many different nations. We're not just the 50 states, but we are essentially different cultural groups within that. I kind of live on the far western edge of Yankeedom. So when I moved from Connecticut to Minnesota, it actually didn't feel all that different. I mean, they sort of are Yankees that kind of made it west till they hit the prairie and didn't go any further. And so I think that part of this as well is this idea of what is the nation state anymore. There clearly are still some needs for a nation, I think, to keep us safe, perhaps in the world, but I think one of the great sort of mistakes we make is this idea that somehow we can come up with public policy that has to be the so-called law of the land. It's actually that kind of universal design idea, which is terribly flawed, I think. And one of the most controversial parts of the book is I talk about gun control laws, right? The thing that everyone's afraid to talk about, right? But guns are a very different thing in, say, rural Maine than they are in the inner city of Chicago. And we think we have to have we think it's being equitable and fair to have the same law everywhere. It's like architects building the same glass skyscraper everywhere. It is crazy to do that. And the fact that we do not understand the nuance of place and culture, that geography matters, and that there, even within those larger geographies, cultural differences that matter. The ideas toward guns in Yankeedom are very different than the ones in the Deep South or in Greater Appalachia. The fact that we don't allow for that difference is simply, I think, not being fair. We, in fact, have a system where one group tries to impose its will, and then the next one gets into office, and then they try to impose their will. And this is not how you have a healthy nation. And so we, in fact, I think, have got to understand, and in a kind of curious way, understand these regional sort of associations. And part of this as well is about building community resilience, because a big part of I think the failure in our political system is that, of course, as many have observed, it's become a system where the people who have the most money get heard the most. When in fact, to me, the most encouraging thing that's going on right now is not what's going on in Washington, which must be one of the most depressing things at the moment, but in fact what's happening at the local level. This idea of communities building resilience by knowing their neighbors. We have a Center for the Study of Pandemics at my university, and the head of it, Mike Osterholm, says that when, not if, but when a pandemic happens, the people who will do the best are the ones who know their neighbors. It has nothing to do with how close you are to a hospital. The hospital will be completely overwhelmed. It will be whether you know your neighbors. In other words, resilience is about knowing your neighbors, caring for each other. Again, this is closer, much closer, I think, to what Adam Smith had in mind for capitalism than what we have now. And so the idea of starting at the very grassroots and empowering people at the neighborhood level, maybe even at the block level, to recognize that they can make a difference, that there are many things that we can do that are really very valuable and are essentially strengthening us in a time when we're going to be seeing increasing numbers of impacts, be it environmental, social, economic, and what have you. I also talk about education. It's interesting when I write about education in the Huffington Post. It's often where I get some of the greatest hate mail, and frequently I get it from teachers. My daughter's a teacher, so I've asked her, why is that? And it's an interesting question. A big influence of mine is Howard Gardner, the professor of education psychology at Harvard, who's written quite a bit about multiple intelligences. And it gets back to that point I was making earlier about the way in which our brains work, how we come up with creative ideas has a lot to do with the way in which we kind of recombine things. But Gardner, for those of you who know his argument, is that I think he now has 8 different kinds of intelligence. And of course, we all have all 8 intelligences to different levels. But there clearly are, some of us are stronger in mathematical intelligence, linguistic intelligence. I'm a strong visual spatial intelligence person. Musical intelligence, nature intelligence, interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence are all forms of intelligence, right? So why do we have an educational system that privileges 2 over all the others. So we have an educational system that tests us for language and math, right? 2 of the 8, right? And so the people who are good in those 2 forms of intelligence we call smart, and everybody else leaves school thinking they're dumb. And the way I see that is I'm at a college of design. I have students who are visually, spatially intelligent. And the number of them that tell me they thought they were stupid until they went to the university and they realized how smart they were, to me is both telling and also tragic. I mean, and I've heard the same from my colleagues over in the music school. Their music students say the same thing. They struggled through K-12 until they get to the university and find that, in fact, they're brilliant because they're musically intelligent. So my argument in the book is to essentially say, well, if we can do it at the university, why can't we do it all the way through the educational system? Why can't we enable kids to learn all of the content that they need to learn through the intelligence that they have? And I argue that you could, in fact, teach every subject visually, spatially. You could teach every subject through music. You could teach it through any of the lenses. I have my son-in-law is a botanist. There's a new intelligence that Howard Gardner has added called nature intelligence. And Otto, my son-in-law, I mean, this guy is brilliant out in the forest. I mean, he knows every tree, every animal. He knows how it all works. He should never have had to sit in a classroom. He would have learned everything if he could have been out in the forest. He could have learned physics. If you give him something to read about nature, he loves to read it, right? And so the argument is that we have to get away from a mass production form of education, which is a 20th century way of feeding a pipeline of people into the old economy that is quickly disappearing, and develop a mass customization educational system that is preparing people for the economy that in fact we have, which is to recognize that people are different, they all learn in different ways, and we need to develop an educational system that encourages that because everybody is smart. The students who fail are students where the system has failed them. They haven't failed anything. The system is failing them because we have an outdated model of education. And this is really not just simply, a kind of left-wing feel-good idea. If we don't do this, our economy is going to tank because we're not going to be competitive globally because other countries are figuring this out much faster than we are. And so, again, we have got to recognize that our educational system needs to be rethought and rescaled so that pretty early on, we enable kids to find the kind of way in which they like to learn and provide them those educational opportunities. So again, it's moving from this mass production education to a mass customization. Here are just 2 examples I talk about. This upper one is a school that's actually in the zoo in Minneapolis. And so this is for nature intelligent kids. They come to this charter school and everything they learn is by being in the zoo. The zoo itself is the classroom. The kids who come to this charter school do extremely well, or the one on the bottom, which is Minnesota bought an old community college and turned it into the state school for the arts. And so kids who are visually, spatially intelligent are, because it was a community college, they actually have dormitories. The kids live there during the school year. And, again, as I've interviewed the kids in this school, so many of them tell me how they were flunking out until they came to the Purpose School, and now they're, doing brilliantly. And so, again, I think the charter school system is one way in which we can begin to mass customize education and not leave anybody behind. A country that has any kind of a system, be it an educational system, a political system, an economy that leaves so many people behind, is a completely dysfunctional, and I think Smith would argue, an immoral system. And so this is something that we are obligated to do. It's not something that we can do on the side. This is central to everybody's ability to thrive in the future. And then the rescaling of the health system. I take on the paper I'm working on is sort of has been part of this. Again, I think that whether you are a fan or a foe of Obamacare, I think that, and we now know the fate of Trump care, but I think both of these methods were highly flawed. Again, because they did not engage the people most affected by the decisions in developing these health systems. Nor do we understand, we do very little to actually deal with health. I think one of the critiques of the work I've been doing in this area of design and health is that these, both Obamacare and the bill that just failed, are really about payment strategies. It does nothing about how do you, in fact, have a healthier population. In fact, there's very few incentives. There are more in Obamacare, but relatively few generally. And so when you begin to look at this, that we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, and we are at the absolute bottom of the developed countries in terms of public health. We spend almost the inverse of other developed countries on public health, preventative health versus acute care. So this is a great country. If you have a rare disease, you want to be in America. But if you want to be a healthy person, this is a terrible country to be in. In fact, I argue in the book, had we set out to make the most unhealthy environment possible for us, what would we have done? Well, we would have infused our food system with sugar, salt, and fat, which is where the food companies make all of their profit. We would ensure that we spend most of our time sitting, right, and driving, which is by far the most dangerous thing any of us did today was drive. We would, isolate ourselves from our neighbors, privilege privacy over community, right? So we have record rates of depression and suicide. I mean, we could not have designed an unhealthier world than the one we've designed today. And so, again, this is about us asking ourselves more fundamental questions about what would a good life be. You know, Adam Smith said a good life is not having what he called lots of baubles, which was his term for a lot of, diamonds that don't do anything for you. A good life is a life in which you, in fact, feel like you are doing good while doing well. And that was supposed to be what capitalism was about. It was the invisible hand of the marketplace was about, in fact, doing good for other people, figuring out a mechanism where everybody was raised up. And if we have a system that is leaving so many people behind and, in fact, widening the gap between a few and the many, or widening the health conditions of so much of our population, it is not a system that is acceptable or sustainable. So we've been doing this at sort of all scales. This is a shot of in the CDC. We were asked to, in fact, work with the Centers for Disease Control and teaching design thinking to all of its leadership. And what's interesting to me about this is what triggered this. When they were dealing with Ebola in West Africa, the CDC officials and the physicians who were there were confused by nobody was listening to them. And they couldn't understand why. And so what we started to do is to say, why don't we ask them why they're not listening to you? And what you quickly heard is that the people of West Africa do not trust their government. So the CDC, which was brought in by their government, they did not trust the CDC. So we said, they said, what do we do? I said, let's ask them, who do you trust? Well, they trust their relatives back in America. So what we started to do was to feed the information via their relatives in America who sent it via social media to their relatives in West Africa. And then it started to happen. People started to change behavior because they heard it from people they trusted, right? And so as a result of that, the CDC realized that they have to operate in a different way. And so latent, implicit in this argument as well is a challenge to the expertise culture. So that just as we are moving away from a mass production way of making things and of educating, we also have a kind of unquestioned control on the part of professions and expertise, that somehow the CDC doctors know what's actually going on with Ebola, so we should all listen to them. And even the CDC is recognizing that expertise is not alone enough, that you have to understand the culture, the place, you have to understand what people believe in, who they'll listen to. So expertise has got to be modified in terms of what is the place you're working in and how do you have to communicate in this place, which might be quite different from another place. And so a lot of these exercises we've been running the CDC through have been to really imagine them facing, in this case we were looking at Zika, the Zika virus, when we were working there last year. And okay, how would you do that differently and say, a Spanish-speaking part of Miami versus, rural Texas. Those are very different populations, very different ways of communicating the same thing. And so part of the argument here is that we have to develop a much more nuanced way and sympathetic and culturally appropriate way to doing a lot of this work. And so, I'll just end by the way I end the book, which is, to make the argument that we all have this capacity. By the way, this is a diagram from IBM. If you haven't followed IBM's trajectory recently, they still make computers, but basically they are a design thinking company. They have amassed the largest collection of designers of any company in the country. And they recognize that the value proposition in companies anymore is about service, about listening to your customers and mass customizing a solution for them. And it may be that they don't even need a computer at all. This is a move away from the idea that a company or a profession sells certain kinds of services. Instead, it's about, okay, what does a group of people need? What does an organization need? And how can we customize a solution? And so this is the sort of 5 steps that they talk about in terms of design thinking. But, again, I just want to make the sort of, to conclude here, make the point that this is a mindset shift. This is a different way to see everything we do. We can begin this the moment we walk out of this room, which is that we need to recognize that the world has shifted underneath us, that in fact in a time where we now have these devices in our pockets which give us access to more, my colleague in computer science said it gives us, he said 25 times the amount of information that existed on the planet in 1995. Right? We have quite literally put the whole world in our hands. And you can't have a shift in medium that powerful without there being a profound shift in culture. And so the old way to think of things, that I'm the expert from the CDC, do what I tell you. I'm the school teacher in front of the room. I'm going to give you the information and you give it back to me on a test. The old idea that I'm IBM and I know what's good for you and buy my computer. That world has disappeared. It's not even going away slowly. It is gone, because of the ability of people to understand and gather information much faster. In fact, what I'm doing right now, I rarely do. I rarely lecture my classes anymore. My students can get the information faster and usually more accurately on their phone before I can give it to them, right? And so what education has become in the university is that, and by the way, the wisdom of the crowd, you all are collectively far wiser than I am, And so if this was my classroom, I would have spent about 5 minutes talking, and then we all would have been talking the rest of this time. And so again, that's how you mass customize education. Everybody is a student and a teacher at the same time. Everybody is a consumer and a producer at the same time. And that is the world we're in, and we need to think about all of the systems in terms of how we are all going to thrive in that world. So thank you very much. And this is the best part, hearing from you. So thank you for having questions. Yes, up here?
We have one right in front.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right.
I think of design thinking as a collaborative process, in which we hold on to ideas tenderly, even though they may turn out to be bad ideas, and we may think that.
Yeah.
And yet our society is so torn apart with a distrust and with heavy ego, and the current administration is only modeling the worst of that.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile this, a collaborative process and a fractured judgmental society?
Yeah, it's a great question. I even have some skeptics among my design colleagues, because there is in the design culture this 20th century idea of the design genius, the Frank Lloyd Wright sort of mentality. who they do not like to collaborate, right? And yet this process, well done, is absolutely a collaborative process, so much so that we find the best results come when it's the group collaborating is as diverse as possible. So when we did the CDC work, for example, they had all the docs in one table, and they had some of the staff people at another table, and we said, okay, no. You're all going to get up, and we are going to make every table as diverse as possible. And the work was much better. In fact, they were the first time that they had even worked together. And so it's absolutely deeply a collaborative process. And again, I would argue that that shift that you're talking about is, again, a shift from the 20th century economy and the 20th century mindset, the kind of hero worship that defined the commodity production. We not only produce commodities of automobiles, we produce commodities of stars, of heroic individuals, usually white men, right, by the way. And that itself is being undermined in this new economy. Simply talk to students at universities like this. I mean, they're extremely skeptical of the heroic white man idea, and are much more interested in working in collaborative teams than later generations. And so this, again, is a cultural shift, I think also facilitated by these devices that we have. It actually enables collaboration at a level that was hard to do before. But it's a great question.
We have a question right here from one of our French exchange students, and then we'll go to the other side next.
Yes, so I'm from France. So I'm from Europe, and in Europe we have like free social security, like free healthcare.
Yeah.
We almost have free education. We don't have the right to bear guns. So it's just a simple question, but I just want to know if is that what you want for the United States?
Well, of course, it isn't all free. You pay taxes.
Yeah,
Right.
but like,
I mean, it's
but
so,
like for example, if you don't
yeah.
pay taxes and you go to the hospital, you'll be treated like.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. I think that system would work in some parts of this country really well. I guess part of my argument is, given the scale of this country, I wonder whether there can be a single system that necessarily works. But I do think that, the interesting thing about what the EU has. And we're already seeing this with colleagues of mine in Canada who say that, if you wanted to be an entrepreneurial country, you would provide a lot of these systems and services at a low cost for everybody, right? I mean, we actually have a system that is so employer dependent for healthcare, for example, that it makes it hard for people to be entrepreneurial because you don't want to leave the company you're in because you'll lose your healthcare, right? And in fact, the change in the economy that I talked about is more and more people, I mean, we're in a kind of entrepreneurial revolution now. It's never been easier to start a company. And the one problem is that how do you get health benefits, right? And so the conversations that are going on in Washington are really fundamental. And what it disturbs me is that people still assume that, well, you get it from your employer. Well, that's not going to be very common anymore in the future. And so so what my colleagues in Canada are doing, they salivate. They just are encouraging entrepreneurs to come over the border. Canada's happy to give them free health care. You want to start a company, come to Toronto. In my case, they go up to Winnipeg, in the middle of the continent. And so, I do think that when you start to think competitively and you realize that there are many things we do that actually put us at a competitive disadvantage, I think that's when things start to change. But it's a good question.
Following up on your beware the single white man as hero archetype,
Yeah.
I'm curious what you're finding to be good practices for busting bias when you're doing design thinking in groups beyond just mixing who's at the table, because you and I are still single hetero white men presumably at the table that are sitting there with our biases.
Yeah. Well, I think that, this process is really good at uncovering all kinds of biases. I mean, one of the key value propositions about this, I was talking to some at the reception, is to ask really fundamental questions. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work in healthcare, and even though I come from a family of doctors, I do not have a health background. And the value proposition that I found quite interesting is when the groups that we work with, the health systems, or in this case, the CDC last year, I say, pretend I'm your grandmother. Explain this to me in a way that your grandmother would understand. And then when I start to, I listen, and then I say, wow, that's odd. Why do you do it that way? Or why do you describe it this way? And it's actually what happens by asking the very simplest kinds of questions, making the familiar strange. Making the thing that everybody is swimming in and help them realize, well, that's an odd thing. Why did I say that? Why do I think that? And so this process is really uncovering all kinds of biases of all sorts and gets people to sort of think anew about the things that they've just assumed. And so it's a kind of bias shedding process, because that's how innovation occurs. Innovators are the ones that are willing to ask the fundamental questions, and Steve Jobs said, why not have a computer you can put in your hand? It's not a phone, it's it's completely different, And nobody asked him to do that. I mean, he did it by just asking a kind of simple, dumb question. And also a lot of innovators will find, and we find this true in these processes, there'll be moments, it's also an improv process. In improv, you never say no. Somebody hands you an idea and you have to build on that idea, right? So you never say no, you never reject anybody else's idea, however crazy it might be, because frequently that's where it often will lead to something that nobody had ever thought about before. So, excuse me, innovation is really about kind of a mindset change of being openness, sort of open to others' ideas, questioning your own biases, and sort of being open to wherever it leads you, as improv does.
So this process involves an interplay between design and business strategy. Mm-hmm. And I look at business strategy as catering towards something that is efficient and cheaper. And in our new and current era, we're approaching artificial intelligence rather quickly. And in the near future, I wonder, how does this design promote artificial intelligence, and what do we have to look out for? Because I think, as human beings, we can come up with creativity, and as you say, these phones, they run our lives nowadays, obviously. Yeah. And so what are the drawbacks, and what does this design offer us in terms of artificial intelligence?
Well, it's interesting. I once got myself in trouble. I was at an AI conference, and I raised my hand, and I said, so why are we so focused on trying to make artificial intelligence like the human brain, when in fact we're pretty good at producing brains? In fact, it's sort of fun, It's called having kids, making love. I mean, what is that really a problem? What's the problem artificial intelligence is trying to solve, right? We do not need more brains. We got brains, right? And and I think that where it's moved to is that there's a lot of things that we make brains do that the brain isn't particularly good at, right? Like rote, routine, boring stuff. It's actually robots are churned out to be much better at doing really boring stuff, right? And I would argue that what that does is it allows the human brain to do what the human brain is really good at, which is the creative process I was describing. That we are really good at, and artificial intelligence is terrible at, because it involves analogy and metaphor, right? Nobody's figured out how to teach a computer how to make a metaphor nobody has ever thought of before. But that's what the brain does really well all the time. And so we do, though, have to recognize that we're probably already in a world where a lot of routine human labor is going to be automated, right? And so the idea that somehow telling people, oh, we're just going to bring the jobs back from China is a false promise, because most of those jobs have just simply disappeared. They're not going to come back from anywhere because they don't exist anymore. We've automated a lot of that work, right? And so the challenge really is how do we create an educational system that everybody can be a part of, and let people's brains do what brains really do well, and recognizing that each one of our brains is different. We're all at different levels in those different kinds of intelligences, right? And so let everybody recognize how they can contribute and have a purposeful life. So I do think that, that's why I deal a lot with education, because that's going to be the biggest challenge. We're going to have a lot of people who are unemployed from a lot of the routine work that is now being done. And yet we can't leave them behind. And so but it's a good question. I mean, I do think that there's a role for AI. It's simply not making more of us.
Thank you. Early on, you talked about education and correctness and creativity,
Yeah.
the stress on correctness and how it just squashes people.
Yeah.
My question is, where do you think the balance is between correctness, which is important?
Yeah.
It is what makes your cell phone or smartphone work,
Yeah.
or your bridge not fall down, and
Yeah.
creativity in the schools.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Obviously, as we're learning, facts matter, right? I mean, you're not allowed to have alternative facts, Gravity works, right? I mean, the war on science is, I think, insane, right? We had a governor, a Republican governor, who came in after he was voted out of office in Minnesota, and he was at our public policy school, and he literally said, "I don't believe in science." And my colleague at the policy school took his pen and literally said, "So do you believe in gravity?" I mean, where does that end, Do you go to a shaman when you're sick? I mean, if you go to the hospital, obviously you believe in science to some level, right? So the war on science is a crazy thing, and this idea that we can't live in a fact-free world. So yes, being correct matters, learning facts matter. But I think the difference is that so much of the traditional education has been pouring facts at kids and expecting them to give us back those facts in tests. And I would argue that given these devices, you have to know facts, but that shouldn't be the core of education. The core of education is, what do you do with those facts? How do you imagine a different world based on those facts? How do you combine facts that nobody has combined before, What does botany have to do with artificial intelligence? Well, I don't know, but that's a good question, I mean, to me, that's what the brain is good at. And so you're right, it has to be a balance between creativity and correctness. But we are very skewed in one direction, and we're seemingly very resistant. We still have this idea that, only a few people are creative, that creativity is this thing that, so a light bulb goes off and it just, all of a sudden you have a creative idea, which again is this heroic genius idea. Most creativity is a collaborative process. And it's something we all have. It's a rigorous process. It's not simply a skill a few people have. We all have that. Those are the things that have to continue to be taught as we go through our educational system. And as proof to how good we're at this, I have a colleague in the educational college who has given creativity tests to kids. And when you give age-appropriate creativity tests to little kids on the playground, over 95% score really high. And he's actually followed these kids through their lives, and he's given the same kids in high school, and only about 10% score high. It's the same people. So it wasn't like the person changed. There was something about the system that is making them, basically driving creativity out of us. And again, if we're going to thrive on this planet, figure out how we're going to support 7+ billion people on a finite planet, we better get creative really quickly. And so it's fundamental, I think, to our survival.
Speaking to multiple intelligences and the concept of correctness and creativity, for yourself, you straddle the line. That's obvious because you're here at UNE, and you're from a design school, and this is a health, and this is a health school mainly. This is what we do here.
Right.
But for you, what are the obstacles or some of the fears that you've encountered? Because I believe that's the major thing when it comes to multiple intelligences and accepting those that straddle that line and feeling like you have to choose a side.
Right.
What things have you noticed when you try to branch out from a point of correctness and a point of multiple intelligences and expressing that everybody does have those capabilities to enhance them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think we all straddle. I mean, we're all made up of multiple intelligences, right? And some people are better than others in one or another. I mean, that's why some go in, why I didn't become a doctor like everyone else in my family. I became a designer. I think that, we were just talking over at the reception how the trend in medical school now is to take the doctors into art museums. and just sort of help them start looking at paintings, start to look at the patient. Rather than looking at the data, you actually look at the patient and look at the color of their skin or what their eyes look like. Or, I mean, you can tell a lot of disease by looking at paintings. And so I think this idea that, the arts and the sciences are not as too much a two-culture thing as we sometimes believe. At my university, the Art Museum has a show where this Spanish artist in the 1880s started to dissect the human brain and started to draw the different neural cells in the brain. And they're incredibly beautiful, but he's like one of the first neuroscientists that recognized that the neural cells that had different functions also had different shapes. And again, so they had the opening of this exhibit a couple weeks back, and there was an art museum full of neuroscientists, right? And so I think that all of these disciplines have a lot to contribute to each other. And I think higher education in the future is going to be one in which really encourages that cross-pollination. Because that's how new knowledge is created. It's not created at the core of a discipline. It's created when one discipline bumps up against another. And the more we can encourage students to bump up against each other and disciplines to bump up against each other, the better off we'll be. I find that, among my health colleagues, I still struggle a bit getting my medical colleagues to be interested in these issues, but nursing and public health totally get this stuff. I mean, we in fact teach design in our School of Public Health because they recognizing, as the CDC has, that you're thrown into these situations and you've got to be innovative and improv a little bit. And nursing also really understands a lot of these issues because they tend to be very strong on the empathy piece. And so I do think that some disciplines are maybe a little further along, but everybody has this capacity. So anyway, it's a good question. Thanks.
So this is maybe a little hard because something that you mentioned before is that there's no one answer to a solution. You mentioned at the beginning that these disciplines should be schooled differently and almost pulled apart. But then I hear a lot of times you mentioning that disciplines need to be, touched together to create these connections. Mm-hmm. Maybe what are your thoughts on is it truly the best answer to pull science students out at K through 12? I just think of what I wanted to do when I was in kindergarten. It was I wanted to be a chef, and then I changed to I wanted to do nature stuff, and I just changed all around. So if my parents pulled me apart and put me in a chef school when I was in kindergarten, do I reach my full potential? Or, maybe the system is good.
Yeah.
Or, I don't.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, that's been some of the pushback to my argument from the educational establishment. They argue, well, if you're already good in your intelligence, we should be challenging you to focus more on the things you're not good on. And there is some argument to that, I'm not particularly strong in math, and so I could do math, but it's always a struggle for me. And am I glad that my teachers forced me to learn math? Yeah. But I also think, though, that you can learn a lot of the content, most of the content, through the intelligence. I think what's also interesting, and this is a bigger challenge for higher ed, I think, even more than the K-12 system. So when you listen to some of the major employers, not just Google and Apple, but actually some of the other major companies, they're starting to say they don't care what your degree is in. They don't care. They want people who can communicate, who can collaborate, who have emotional intelligence, who are resilient. That's who they find, and that are curious, that are quick learners, that are open to new ideas. Turns out that in the 21st century, those so-called soft skills may be far more important than whether you've memorized the terms of every part of the human body. And so I do think that we've got to fundamentally question even how higher ed is structured. That's why I find coming to places like this and centers like this so interesting. Having people like me talk to an audience from a Center for that's looking at kind of global issues is that the more, again, that we recognize that we have, I think, a responsibility to prepare students for the economies that they're going into, that it may not be content related, that in fact, I mean, as I was saying, the idea of the professor has changed fundamentally. We don't lecture anymore. And if we are lecturing, I'm actually involved in a process of redesigning the first 2 years of our medical education at Minnesota, because the students are revolting. I mean, the first 2 years, I don't know if there are any docs or med students in the audience, but I grew up listening to all my cousins talk about their medical education. It is horrendous. I mean, it's day in, day out lecturing and memorization, right? Crazy. And no, students are not putting up with it anymore, right? They're burning out, they're leaving. And so, I've got them now working with our College of Education, which is developing ways to have an engaging education. And so I do think that content matters. This is, again, the correctness piece, but the way in which we're doing it, this kind of shoving content down people's throats and expecting, thinking we're educated if they just give it back to us, no longer works. That paradigm is broken. The future of an educator, for example, is about being a provocateur, asking the kind of dumb questions of like, so why did you say that? Or, have you thought about this? I mean, it's more of a questioner and a facilitator than it is that I'm some sort of font of wisdom and you're students and I'm just going to pour knowledge into. That is a broken system. So, I think that, it's interesting. There's a book called The Platform Revolution, and it's talking about the characteristics of this new economy. And it says any system where there's a gatekeeper, where there's asymmetry of knowledge, and where there's a demand for that knowledge is going to get rolled over in this economy. Absolutely rolled by this economy, because this economy destroys gatekeepers. And it finds a way to level knowledge, asymmetries of knowledge, and it meets demand, right? And so what does higher ed do? We all brag about how hard it is to get into these institutions, right? We're all, so we're like the Uber gatekeepers. There's asymmetry of knowledge, students coming in listening to professors, and there's a demand for it because we're in a knowledge economy. So higher ed is going to get rolled. And it is very vulnerable to disruption right now. And I don't think that's a shocking thing. I just think it's the reality. And so we, as institutions, have got to fundamentally rethink what we're doing. And the way to do that, I would do it as a designer. I would engage my students to say, how do you want to learn? And I bet it isn't, I teach one of my classes nomadically. I let my students decide where they're going to learn. Never once do they pick a classroom. I mean, these are not fun places to spend your time. They always find places with comfortable chairs, usually good coffee. It's Minnesota, so they've actually found places where there's working fires going, but what to me is interesting is, one, if you give students a choice, they will tell you how they want to learn. And I go with them, I listen to them, I learn from them as they learn from me, right? But the other thing that's interesting is that in the Middle Ages, before there was the printed book, there was this idea of memory palaces, which is that people would memorize huge amounts of information through mnemonic devices. And what I'm finding is that when my students are nomadic and we move around the campus and the community learning, they remember the information better, because they'll say, oh, that's what we talked about when we were sitting in those comfortable chairs drinking that over in that coffee shop. They remember the information better. And so, again, these are experiments. Higher ed should be experimenting like crazy. Anyway, that's a long and confusing answer to your question, but good question. Yeah.
With this words of wisdom, we thank everybody for attending, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody.